High above the patchwork fields of occupied Europe, the air was thin and dangerously cold. Inside the unpressurized aluminum fuselage of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, 10 men shivered in their sheepskin flight suits. The drone of 4 massive radial engines created a deafening roar that vibrated through every bone in their bodies. It was the year 1943, and the United States 8th Air Force was embarking on yet another daylight raid deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The sky outside was a deceptive blue, soon to be marred by the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire that the crews called flak. Each man scanned the horizon, searching for the glint of enemy fighter wings, knowing that at any moment, metal shards could rip through the thin skin of their aircraft. The stakes could not have been higher for the Allied forces struggling to gain a foothold on the European continent. The German war machine was churning out tanks, aircraft, and munitions at a terrifying rate, fueled by the industrial might of the Ruhr Valley and the sprawling factories of Berlin. Strategic bombing was seen not just as a way to destroy these physical assets, but as the only method to bring the war directly to the German people before a ground invasion was even possible. If the bombers failed to cripple the Luftwaffe and the industrial base of the Third Reich, the planned invasion of France would surely end in a massacre on the beaches. The entire outcome of the war in the West hinged on the success of these perilous missions. At the center of this massive aerial campaign in the British theater stood Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, known to his men and the public as Bomber Harris. He was a man of unshakable conviction who believed that air power alone could bring Germany to its knees. Harris advocated for area bombing, a controversial strategy that targeted entire cities rather than specific factories, aiming to destroy the housing and morale of the German workforce. While the Americans initially clung to the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, Harris sent his Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers out by night, under the cover of darkness, to unleash torrents of incendiaries upon the dense urban centers of the enemy. His resolve was ironclad, even as the moral debate raged quietly in the corridors of power. The central question that haunted the commanders and the crews alike was whether a nation could truly be bombed into submission. Could the destruction of cities break the will of a populace that had been indoctrinated by years of propaganda? Every mission tested this hypothesis in blood and fire. As the bomber streams grew larger, stretching for miles across the sky, the resistance from the ground grew more desperate. The German defenses adapted with deadly efficiency, utilizing radar-guided searchlights and heavy flak batteries that turned the night sky into a dazzling, lethal light show. The cost of this strategy was measured in the empty bunks of air bases across East Anglia, where thousands of young men failed to return from the void. The technology of the era promised precision that it rarely delivered in the chaos of combat. The American Norden bomb sight was a marvel of engineering, a mechanical computer that claimed to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. However, the reality of war intervened with cloud cover, smoke screens, and the sheer terror of being under fire. Bombardiers struggled to keep the crosshairs steady, while their aircraft bucked and weaved through exploding shells. More often than not, the bombs fell wide of the target, tearing up open fields or civilian neighborhoods instead of the intended rail yards or oil refineries. This inaccuracy forced the planners to send more planes and drop more tonnage, escalating the violence in a grim cycle. By the summer of 1943, the Royal Air Force prepared for a series of raids that would change the face of the war. The target was Hamburg, a bustling port city and industrial hub. Arthur Harris authorized the use of a new device called Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped to confuse German radar. On the night of July 24th, the bombers arrived over Hamburg with their radar countermeasures, rendering the German defenses blind. The Pathfinders marked the targets with glowing flares, and the main force unleashed a mixture of high explosives and incendiaries. The result was not just a raid, but the creation of a new meteorological phenomenon on Earth known as the firestorm. The physics of the Hamburg firestorm were terrifyingly simple, yet unprecedented in human history. The thousands of incendiary bombs started countless small fires that quickly merged into a single, massive conflagration. The heat was so intense that it caused the air above the city to rise rapidly, creating a vacuum at ground level. Fresh oxygen was sucked in from the surrounding countryside at hurricane speeds, feeding the flames until they reached temperatures that melted glass and asphalt. Trees were uprooted and people were pulled into the inferno by the sheer force of the wind. The city became a furnace, consuming everything in its path and leaving little behind but ash and silence. The devastation of Hamburg sent a shockwave through the Nazi hierarchy, with officials fearing that the war was lost. Yet the German resolve hardened rather than crumbled. In the daylight skies, the American crews faced a different kind of horror during the Schweinfurt raids later that year. Their target was the ball-bearing factories crucial to the German aviation industry. Without long-range fighter escorts, the B-17 formations were vulnerable to relentless attacks by Luftwaffe fighters. The German pilots flying Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slashed through the bomber formations, firing cannons and rockets. The losses were catastrophic, forcing the Allied commanders to pause and rethink their strategy before the bomber force was annihilated completely. A turning point arrived with the introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang, a fighter aircraft capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With drop tanks extending their range, these sleek fighters could challenge the Luftwaffe over their own territory. The balance of power in the skies began to shift. The Mustang pilots, aggressive and skilled, hunted down the German interceptors, clearing a path for the heavy bombers. This development allowed the Allies to resume deep penetration raids with renewed vigor. The objective was no longer just to bomb targets, but to lure the German Air Force into the sky and destroy it through attrition. As 1944 dawned, the combined bomber offensive intensified with the Big Week, a targeted campaign against the German aircraft industry. Thousands of sorties were flown in a span of days, pounding assembly plants and airfields. The skies over Europe were filled with contrails, a visual testament to the sheer scale of the industrial war. The Luftwaffe fought back ferociously, but they could not replace their experienced pilots as fast as they were losing them. The Allies, backed by the immense production capabilities of the United States, could absorb the losses and keep coming. The air war had become a brutal numbers game, and the numbers were turning against the Third Reich. The focus then shifted to the German capital, Berlin. Arthur Harris believed that destroying the nerve center of the Nazi regime would bring about the collapse of the government. The Battle of Berlin was a protracted series of raids fought through the terrible weather of the winter. The Royal Air Force bombers battled icing, storms, and a desperate night fighter defense. Berlin was a sprawling metropolis, difficult to destroy completely, but the relentless pounding turned vast districts into rubble. The citizens of Berlin lived in cellars and subway tunnels, emerging only to clear the debris and bury the dead. The city became a moonscape of ruins, a symbol of the total destruction that had befallen the nation. In February 1945, with the Russian army advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west, the controversial raid on Dresden took place. Dresden was a historic city, known for its Baroque architecture and culture, filled with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. It was also a rail hub and communications center. The attack was carried out by both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. The resulting firestorm mirrored the horror of Hamburg, consuming the medieval city center and killing tens of thousands of people in a single night. The destruction of Dresden remains one of the most debated actions of the entire conflict. The aftermath of the Dresden raid raised uncomfortable questions among the Allied leadership and the public. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had long supported the strategic bombing campaign, began to distance himself from the terror bombing tactics as the war drew to a close. The sight of the charred bodies and the ruined cultural landmarks cast a long shadow over the victory that was now inevitable. However, the momentum of the war machine was difficult to stop. The bombers continued their work, targeting transportation networks and fuel depots, effectively grounding the German army and air force due to a lack of oil. The strategic campaign had paralyzed the enemy infrastructure. While the air war in Europe reached its crescendo, a different but equally destructive campaign was unfolding in the Pacific theater against the Empire of Japan. The distances involved in the Pacific required a new kind of weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This massive bomber was pressurized, faster, and carried a heavier payload than its predecessors. Initially, the Americans attempted to use the same high-altitude precision bombing tactics that had been used in Europe. Operating from bases in China and later the Mariana Islands, the B-29 crews struggled against the jet stream, high-altitude winds that disrupted their bomb sites and scattered their formations. The results of the early B-29 raids were disappointing, with little damage inflicted on the Japanese war industry. The engines of the superfortresses were prone to overheating in the tropical climate, and the logistical nightmare of supplying bases in China proved overwhelming. A change in command was deemed necessary to break the stalemate. General Curtis LeMay, a tough and pragmatic commander known for his aggressive tactics in Europe, was brought in to take charge of the 20th Air Force. LeMay analyzed the situation and made a radical decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War and the history of aerial warfare. Curtis LeMay realized that the Japanese industrial base was different from that of Germany. Instead of large centralized factories, Japan relied on a network of small workshops embedded within residential neighborhoods. These cottage industries produced parts for weapons and aircraft in wooden buildings that were highly flammable. LeMay decided to abandon high-altitude precision bombing in favor of low-altitude night attacks using incendiary bombs. He ordered the defensive guns removed from the B-29 aircraft to increase their speed and bomb load. It was a calculated risk that exposed his crews to enemy fire, but promised devastating results if successful. On the night of March 9, 1945, the new tactic was put to the test in Operation Meeting House. Over 300 B-29 bombers took off from the Mariana Islands, headed for Tokyo. They flew low at altitudes of only 5,000 to 8,000 feet to avoid the strong winds of the jet stream. The lead pathfinders dropped napalm-filled canisters to mark the target zone, a densely populated working-class district of the capital. The main force followed, unleashing a rain of incendiary clusters designed to penetrate the wooden roofs of the Japanese houses and ignite uncontrollable fires. The resulting inferno in Tokyo exceeded even the grim expectations of the planners. The strong winds fanned the flames into a sweeping tide of fire that jumped fire breaks and canals. The heat was intense enough to boil the water in the canals where civilians sought refuge. The B-29 crews flying above reported smelling burning wood and flesh, and their aircraft were buffeted by the thermal updrafts rising from the dying city. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, surpassing the death tolls of Hamburg, Dresden, or the later atomic attacks. In just a few hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo were reduced to white ash. The casualty figures from the Tokyo firebombing were staggering, with estimates ranging from 80,000 to over 100,000 dead. The psychological impact on the Japanese leadership was profound, although they refused to surrender immediately. LeMay did not pause. With the success of the Tokyo raid, he launched a systematic campaign against other major Japanese cities including Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The B-29 fleet, growing in size every week, roamed over Japan with impunity, burning out the industrial heart of the empire city by city. The night skies over Japan glowed red with the fires of destruction. The relentless firebombing campaign had a dual effect. It destroyed the ability of Japan to produce the weapons of war, and it brought the reality of defeat to the doorstep of every citizen. Food distribution collapsed, and millions were rendered homeless. The blockade by American submarines and the mining of harbors by B-29 aircraft cut off imports, leaving the nation starving. Yet the Japanese military government prepared for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands. The Allies looked at the devastation they had wrought and feared that an invasion would still cost 1 million American casualties against such a determined foe. The culmination of the strategic bombing campaign arrived in August 1945, not with thousands of bombers, but with lone B-29 aircraft carrying a new, terrible weapon. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final, decisive blows that forced the Japanese surrender. However, these events were the endpoint of a trajectory that had begun years earlier with the conventional bombing of cities. The firebombing raids had already established the precedent of total destruction. The nuclear age did not start in a vacuum. It was born from the ashes of Tokyo, Hamburg, and Dresden, where the distinction between combatant and civilian had been erased. When the guns finally fell silent, the Allied Strategic Bombing Survey was commissioned to analyze the effectiveness of the air campaigns. Teams of experts toured the ruined cities of Germany and Japan, interviewing survivors and examining the wreckage. Their report concluded that while air power had been decisive, it had not won the war alone. It had destroyed the enemy transportation and oil industries, making conventional resistance impossible, but the morale of the civilian populations had proven surprisingly resilient. The terror bombing had caused immense suffering, but it had not caused the people to rise up against their governments as the pre-war theorists had predicted. The moral legacy of the strategic bombing campaign remains a subject of intense debate among historians and ethicists. The deliberate targeting of civilian centers violated the traditional rules of war, yet the commanders argued it was necessary to end the conflict quickly and save Allied lives. The pilots and crews who flew these missions grappled with their own consciences. They were young men doing a job that was terrifying and technically demanding, often detached from the horror unfolding on the ground miles below. They were hailed as heroes for their bravery, yet the results of their actions were scenes of apocalyptic horror. Reconstruction of the devastated cities began almost immediately after the surrender. In Germany, the women known as rubble women worked tirelessly to clear the millions of tons of debris by hand. Historic landmarks were painstakingly rebuilt using the original stones whenever possible. In Japan, the wooden cities rose again from the ashes, modernized and reimagined. The scars of the bombing remained in the memories of the survivors and the empty spaces where neighborhoods once stood. The physical recovery was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, even in the face of total annihilation. The strategic bombing of World War II fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. It proved that the home front was no longer safe from the violence of the front lines. The ability to project power across continents and destroy the economic capacity of an enemy became a cornerstone of military strategy during the Cold War. The heavy bomber evolved into the intercontinental ballistic missile, but the logic remained the same: the threat of unacceptable destruction as a means of coercion. The shadow of the bomber wings that darken the skies of Europe and Asia stretches all the way to the present day. Today, the memorials in cities like Dresden and Tokyo stand as somber reminders of the cost of total war. They ask us to remember not just the strategic victories or the technological marvels, but the human lives that were extinguished in the firestorms. The pilots who flew into the flak and the families who huddled in the cellars shared a tragic moment in history where the machinery of death outpaced the capacity for mercy. The whisper of time carries the echoes of the air raid sirens, a warning from the past about the terrible price of conflict when the sky itself turns into an enemy. As we look back on the devastation of cities from the sky, we are left with the uneasy realization that the line between necessity and atrocity is often blurred in the heat of survival. The strategic bombing campaign contributed to the defeat of tyranny, but it did so by unleashing forces of destruction that mankind struggles to control to this day. The ruins have been paved over, and the skies are now filled with the commerce of peace, yet the history of those dark nights serves as a permanent vigil. It reminds us that in the pursuit of victory, humanity can lose a part of itself among the clouds.